The Father of His Country, George Washington, by Bella Koral. When George Washington was born in a comfortable plantation farmhouse in Virginia, most of this land was still a wilderness. Virginia was one of 13 colonies belonging to England. There was no such thing as the United States. By the time George was 6, he had 3 younger brothers and a sister, and his family lived at another of their plantations called Ferry Farm. George loved to swim and fish in the Rappahannock River that ran close to the Ferry Farm. When he played at pitching horseshoes, his arm was sure, and when he wrestled, he could easily down any boy his size. He was a fine rider and was proud of his pony, Hero. The sexton of a nearby church taught George to spell and write, for schools in Virginia were few. He acquired a beautiful handwriting, but never did learn to spell really well. Another teacher taught him arithmetic. George was very good at that. Young George and his companions loved to watch sailboats and trading ships from Boston and New York pass by the plantation on the river. Sometimes they landed at the Washington's wharf. The boy would watch eagerly as the sailors unloaded their cargoes and reloaded the boats with tobacco and other crops to take back to England. George dreamed that he too might one day wear a captain's uniform and sail to foreign lands. One day when George was about 10, an English ship brought his 2 older half-brothers, Lawrence and Austin. They were returning from England to help their father manage his plantations. Lawrence, 14 years older than George, became the young boy's hero. When George was 11, their father died. Mrs. Washington now had to care for her 5 young children and manage the Ferry Farm plantation. As was the custom then, Mr. Washington had left most of his other property to his eldest son, Lawrence. This was the plantation on the Potomac River, where the family had lived before coming to Ferry Farm. Lawrence soon married and rebuilt the house he had inherited. He named it Mount Vernon. George was going to a new school where his teacher gave him a book called The Rules of Civility. It contained 110 maxims for good conduct that George copied out in his fine handwriting. Some such as, "Cleanse not your teeth with the tablecloth," seem humorous to us today, but the maxim George took closest to his heart was, "Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience." George was delighted when one day he came upon some surveyor's instruments his father had used to measure land. George had always liked arithmetic and numbers. Now he decided to study surveying. He became expert at it. By the time he was 16, George was spending most of his time at Mount Vernon. A neighbor, an Englishman named Lord Fairfax, who had been a soldier and had seen a great deal of the world, owned vast, unmeasured tracts of land in Virginia. He liked the way George rode a horse, and they often went fox hunting together. Soon they became fast friends. Lord Fairfax saw how brave George was, and how careful and exact in everything he did. So before long, he asked George to be one of a party of surveyors he was sending out to measure his property. He hoped that after the land was surveyed and divided into farms, more settlers would go there to live. The surveyors could travel only a small distance each day, for the forests were dense. Sometimes they had to swim their horses across streams. At nights, wrapped in a blanket, George slept before a campfire or in a hut. Once, when his straw bed caught fire, he nearly burned to death. Another time, a band of Indian braves, wearing war paint and feathers, slipped into camp. They were the first warrior Indians George had ever seen, but they were quite friendly to the surveyors, who gave them gifts and asked them to perform their war dance. George thought their dance was very comical and wrote about it in his copybook. Lord Fairfax was so pleased with George's work that he arranged to have him chosen surveyor for the county. George bought land with the money he earned, and for the next 3 years the young surveyor made many long journeys into the Virginia wilderness. There he learned the ways of Indians and backwoodsmen. He learned how to face danger and be prepared for anything. And he learned how to be a leader of men. From his brother Lawrence and Lord Fairfax, he gained enough knowledge of military tactics to become a major in the Virginia militia. Now came a sad time for George. Lawrence became very ill. George went with him to the West Indies, hoping the climate might help. This was the only time George was ever to leave his native land. But Lawrence did not get better. After his death, when his estate was settled, George became master of Mount Vernon. Now trouble had been brewing for some time in the colonies. Frenchmen were coming down from Canada, claiming land the English said belonged to their king. They were building forts and, with the help of Indians friendly to them, were driving out Virginia backwoodsmen who had built settlements in the wilderness. The governor of Virginia decided to send a message to the French commander, ordering him to stop building forts and to allow the settlers to live in peace. For this mission, the governor needed a brave, determined man who knew the wilderness well. He chose George Washington. With some Indians, hunters, and a guide named Gist, Washington started on the dangerous journey. He won over to his side another Indian chieftain. Who helped him and his companions reach the French fort. The French commander there replied to the Virginia governor that he had been ordered to hold that fort, and there he would stay. By the time Washington and his guides started back, it was December. The ground was covered with snow, and they could not use horses. They planned to cross the Allegheny River by walking over the ice. But now they found it was only partly frozen. Great cakes of ice floated through the open waters. The two men began cutting down trees for a raft, but it was slow work, for they had only a single hatchet. While steering their raft between cakes of ice, George was pitched into the water. Almost drowned, he struggled back on board, his clothes frozen stiff. The two men spent that bitterly cold night on an island. By morning, the ice on the river was firm, and they were able to walk across to shelter. After many such adventures, Washington delivered the French commander's reply to the governor, together with his own report of what he had found out. Everywhere, people in the colony praised Washington's skill and courage. Soon the governor appointed him a lieutenant colonel of Virginia troops. The next winter, the English sent a strong force of British troops to America under, under General Braddock to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley and to teach the Indians a lesson. Braddock had heard of the fearless young Washington who knew the western wilderness so well. He invited him to be his aide. What a handsome sight Braddock's army made in their bright red coats as they marched in perfect order. The colonial soldiers under Washington did not even wear uniforms. Like the Indians, they wore buckskin shirts and fringed leggings. The English called them buckskins. Braddock and his soldiers had never fought in the wilderness. They were to attack a French fort near where Pittsburgh now stands. Washington, who knew how the Indians and the French fought from behind rocks and trees, tried to warn Braddock, but the general replied proudly, "It would be too bad if British troops could not meet a handful of naked Indians." In their proud scarlet coats, Braddock's fine army marched through a narrow road in the forest, not far from the French fort they had planned to attack. Suddenly, shots rang out from behind rocks and trees. The woods echoed with Indian war yells, but no one was seen. The English troops, confused by this strange fighting, huddled together like sheep. Their scarlet coats fine targets for the Indians. The buckskins, of course, knew how to meet the Indians. They took cover behind trees, too, and returned the fire. Through all the confusion, it was Washington who prevented the English from being entirely wiped out. Bullets riddled his hat and uniform. 2 horses were shot from under him, and he jumped on the back of a third. It was a miracle he escaped unharmed. Braddock was not so lucky. Not until he was wounded did he order a retreat. He died 4 days later, grateful that his aide Washington was at his side. Braddock's defeat grieved the people, but they were proud of Washington, who had upheld the honor of the buckskins. He was made commander-in-chief of the Virginia troops and became renowned throughout the colonies. For 3 years after this, Washington commanded troops in the West. The French were finally driven back to Canada by fresh armies from England and by colonial troops in the North. When Washington was 27, he married Mrs. Martha Custis, a widow with 2 small children. He took them to live with him at Mount Vernon. He came to love Martha's children as if they were his own, and they loved him dearly, too. Soon after his marriage, Washington was elected a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses to represent the people of his county and to help make some of the laws of the colony. At Mount Vernon, Washington lived the life of a gentleman farmer, planting crops and raising cattle and horses. 15 happy, peaceful years followed, and Washington would have liked nothing better than to spend the rest of his life in this way. But storm clouds were gathering. The colonies had always considered England their mother country, but when the new king, George III, came to the throne, he decided to make them pay the huge costs of the French and Indian War. He made unwise laws, forcing the colonies to trade only with England. Then extra harsh taxes were laid on almost everything the colonists used. They could not drink even a cup of tea without paying England a tax on it. In Boston, 50 patriots dumped a shipload of tea into the harbor rather than pay the tax. To punish them, the king ordered Boston Harbor closed. This meant hunger and suffering for the people, and the king sent troops to arrest or shoot anyone disobeying his commands. The colonies, aroused at this, decided to act together. They sent delegates, Washington among them, to a congress at Philadelphia. They sent the king a petition begging him not to enforce his unjust laws. No answer came back. The colonists began drilling and arming their soldiers. Washington was asked to train the men of his county. He loved peace, but he said no man should hesitate to use arms in defense of freedom. Then in April 1775 came the dreaded news. A company of British soldiers started secretly toward Concord, near Boston, to seize arms and gunpowder the colonists had hidden. News of their plans was spread by swift riders during the night. Quickly, farmers and townsmen took up their muskets and gathered at Lexington to stop them. Shots were fired by both sides, and many men were killed. The Battle of Lexington, began the long Revolutionary War. Again, a Congress was called in Philadelphia. Washington appeared there in the uniform of a Virginia colonel. It was his way of saying, "The time for fighting has come, and I am ready." The delegates voted to make this Congress the government of the 13 colonies. They appointed Washington commander-in-chief of their armies. No other man was so well fitted to command. He refused pay for his services. At Cambridge, near Boston, Washington took command of his army. It was an odd army, the men poorly armed and trained, and dressed as they happened to come from their shops or farms. But they were brave and would defend their country with all their might. It was the first American army. In a few months, Washington had trained these men so well that the British, knowing they could not hold out, sailed away from Boston. But Washington knew the British would attack New York, so he moved his army there. And then came wonderful news from Philadelphia. On the 4th of July, 1776, the colonies declared themselves free from England. The British, however, did not accept this, and the war continued. Until that time, the colonies had been fighting for their right to make their own laws and raise their own taxes, even if they were subjects of the king. But with the Declaration of Independence, they had made themselves a free and independent nation. King George would never rule over them again. Washington had the Declaration read to his troops. Its ringing words would make them fight on till every British soldier had left America. Washington often had to retreat, but he held on through long, bitter years. Even when others thought all was lost, he had faith. By the winter of 1776, Washington's army had managed to reach Pennsylvania across the Delaware River. The British were in Trenton on the New Jersey side of the Delaware, waiting for the river to freeze over solid. Then they would be able to march across and destroy Washington's army. But Washington had a daring plan. He would turn the tables on the British and their hired troops, the Hessians, who were preparing to celebrate Christmas while waiting for the Delaware to freeze. In the wind and sleet of that stormy night, Washington's men rowed across the river, pushing their boats through great cakes of floating ice. Some of them were barefoot, shivering in their ragged clothes. The path they took to the river was marked by their bloody footprints in the snow. Yet somehow they managed to get themselves, their horses, and their cannon across the icy Delaware to Trenton. The Hessians and their British officers were sleeping soundly. At dawn they woke to the thunder of American guns and could hardly believe what was happening. After a short battle, they surrendered. Washington's victory at Trenton was a Christmas gift that brought joy and fresh courage to the new nation. But more hardships were in store. The next winter, Washington's army camped in nearby Valley Forge. Deep snow lay on the ground. The men had no shoes, and their feet were wrapped in rags. The wind blew through their tattered clothes, and there was not enough to eat. Many died of hunger and disease. Some left camp, unable to suffer any longer. Washington stayed in a hut close to his men, sharing their hardships. Martha, his wife, came to spend the winter with her husband and went from hut to hut to comfort the sick. Washington's heart was heavy with suffering for his men. It seemed that the terrible winter would never end. He kept begging Congress to send supplies. But before the war was over, a young French nobleman, Lafayette, arrived at Valley Forge. He had heard of Washington and America's struggle for freedom and had come to help. A warm friendship sprang up between Washington and young Lafayette, who soon became the general's aide. This young man contributed nobly to the American cause. When spring came, food and supplies began rolling into camp. The men were cheered, and Washington's hopes rose. Then came the wonderful news that France was joining America in the war. Yet even with the French help, there were to be 3 more years of bloody battles. But Washington's faith was like a rock to his men. In October 1781, a large British army under General Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown, Virginia. American guns had been firing at the British fort for days. French ships had blockaded the redcoats from the sea. The British had to give up. They sent out a messenger with a white flag of truce. Washington rode with his officers to the meadow where the British were to surrender. He sat on his horse, watching from a slight distance as man after man laid down his musket. Then the British general handed his sword to an American officer. It was his act of surrender. Finally, King George III had to admit that his 13 colonies were now the United States of America, and a peace treaty was signed. When the last British soldiers sailed from New York, Washington felt his task was done. There at Fraunces Tavern, he bade farewell to his officers, urging them to serve the nation they had fought so hard to build. At last, after 8 years, Washington came back to Mount Vernon. Here he planned to spend the rest of his life peacefully as a farmer. But Mount Vernon was always filled with company. Important people kept coming to pay their respects. They brought troubling news that the 13 states had begun to quarrel with one another and were not really united. Wise men saw something must be done to save the country, so a great convention was held in Philadelphia to make a set of rules, a constitution to govern the whole country. This convention chose Washington to preside over it. There were many stormy arguments by the delegates, but his calm wisdom was always there to guide them. The convention brought forth a great and wonderful work, the Constitution, by which the United States has been governed ever since. According to this Constitution, the people were to elect a president for the new government. They chose a man they trusted and honored above all others, George Washington. Though he had hoped to spend his remaining years at Mount Vernon, Washington could not refuse when called to serve. So in April 1789, he left Mount Vernon for New York. It was to be the first capital of the United States. All along the way, there were parades and celebrations in his honor. He crossed the Hudson on a barge decked with flags. Bells rang as he reached New York. Crowds cheered and cannon roared. Houses were bright with flags. Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall, looking down into the faces of the people. The wild cheers hushed as he stepped forward and laid his hand on the Bible. Slowly and clearly, he repeated the oath every president has taken since then. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Long live our President! Cried the people. They loved and trusted him, for he was wise, fearless, and strong. To them he was indeed first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And to all Americans ever since, he has remained the father of his country. Inscription at Mount Vernon. Washington, the brave, the wise, the good, supreme in war, in council, and in peace, valiant without ambition, discreet without fear, confident without presumption, in disaster calm, in success moderate, in all himself. The hero, the patriot, the Christian, the father of nations, the friend of mankind, who when he had won all, renounced all, and sought in the bosom of his family and of nature retirement, and in the hope of religion, immortality. And that's it for this week. Thanks for listening.